Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this Veteran Studies Association Colloquium series. We're grateful for your presence and your participation today. We're honored to welcome our speaker for today, Cam Telch, who will be presenting on Antietam and shell shock. So please note that today's session will be recorded and will be made available to you after this session today. We encourage you to engage, reflect, and share any thoughts or questions that you have in the chat and during the Q&A session. With that, I am pleased to turn things over to Cam Telch. Cam, the floor is yours.
Thank you for hosting me, Dr. Henderson. My name is Cameron Telch. I am a doctoral candidate in educational studies at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. My dissertation is on the representation of shell shock in Canadian war museums. I will be using the voices of Canadian shell shock soldiers to inform the way museums are structured and dynamics. I will be using their voices for museums to critique their work and to allow for better representation in the future. So, the first, you'll be hearing two archival discoveries that I made in 2024. The first one I'm about to tell you is called Antietam in the Lower 40, and it's an American play about shell shock. I came across this play in the archives, and from my own research, it is the second known American play about shell shock, and this play came out in 1958. All right. Exploring mental health can lead to destigmatization, understanding, and breaks the perception of mental health issues as the other. Revealing the perspectives of people with mental illness can provide them with a platform to share their experiences, even if they lived over 100 years ago. History educators have an excellent opportunity to explore an important mental health issue, shell shock, by using this play and other forms of cultural material. In this review essay, I will be exploring how shell shock is presented in a play that has yet to be analyzed, providing history educators with a possible stimulus for conversations about shell shock and other forms of mental health with students. All armies who served in the First World War universally suffered from shell shock. Shell shock was a highly debated and complicated medical condition encompassing both physical and psychological symptoms. The symptoms of shell shock included anxiety, depression, nightmares, uncontrollable crying, hallucinations, stammering, shaking, dizziness, blindness, muteness, and temporary paralysis. Soldiers and officers of the Great War were subjected to the horrors of warfare, including relentless artillery bombardments, machine gun fire, gas attacks, as well as environmental hardships such as mud, rain, sleet, and rats. The terrors of trench warfare led soldiers and officers to either suffer a nervous breakdown or they were diagnosed with the physical symptoms of shell shock if they were physically wounded in combat. The Canadian and British narratives of shell shock are well known in the current historiography. 15,000 Canadians and 200,000 British military personnel were diagnosed with shell shock throughout the course of the First World War. What is underrepresented in the current historiography is the American experience of shell shock due to their late entry into the war. Despite entering the war in 1917, between 15,000 and 76,000 American soldiers and officers suffered from shell shock from the conditions of warfare. Unlike their Canadian and American counterparts who regarded shell shock as a sign of personal weakness or poor genetics, Americans understood shell shock as another war wound. American officials knew that combat could lead to psychological or physical distress and were committed to treating all cases of shell shock. After the war's end, different narratives of shell shock appeared in different media outlets, including newspapers and magazines, fictional books, and soldiers' memoirs and plays in Canada, Britain, and the United States. One play that depicted shell shock was Edward L. Camrack's 1958 Antietam in the Lower 40. Camrack's play derived from the original narrative by Irma Graber. It was performed in Wisconsin, and the cast included Camrack himself, Eleanor Grant, Lois Dick, Julia Mailer, Professor Haskell Block, William Schreck, and Professor Sherwood Collins. Antietam features Jim Erickson, an American Great War veteran, and the play's protagonist returning to his family farm in Grant County, Wisconsin in the spring of 1919. The play centered on the family's attempt to rehabilitate Jim, who suffered from shell shock from the war. The play focuses on the breakdown of family dynamics as Jim's immediate family proposes different ways to treat Jim, whether it's through physical labor on the farm or with time and compassion. Other characters featured in the play include Grandma, Ma, Pa, Dr. Baker, Jim's brother Ernie, and Jim's love interest Aggie. Antietam was framed as an anti-war play since it portrayed the lingering psychological consequences of the First World War and how they destroyed the life of a young American veteran. My review essay served as the play's first critique in over 60 years and argued that Jim embodied the universal suffering of all shell-shocked soldiers from the First World War. Jim's experiences break the historical perspective of the other as he brings attention to an underrated group of combat veterans from the First World War who have been historically persecuted due to their mental trauma. The American experience of the Great War of Shell Shock. Antietam portrayed the return of a traumatized veteran from European battlefields of the Great War. While combat ended before 1919, the war very much stayed in Jim's mind, according to his brother Ernie. According to Ernie, he says, "We drove up to town in the buggy to meet Jim's train, and the minute he got off, I felt that there was something wrong. Ma saw in him too, a kind of farawayness. Although Jim physically survived the war, he was left with haunting internal scars. Jim was an empty vessel, devoid of life because of his combat experiences. The inner battles within Jim's mind explicitly demonstrated the Great War's power. The daily physical and psychological casualties from trench warfare and combat, the mobilization of entire countries committed to a war of attrition, and the day-to-day hardships that all soldiers endured. The fact that Jim's mind was still fixated on the war while at home demonstrated that he relived his horrors daily and could not forget those dreadful memories that haunted his psyche. Antietam showcased that mental health was not well understood among most Americans. According to the character Dr. Baker, mental health is so hard to put your fingers on, not like measles or bumps that you can confidently prescribe for when you know where you're at. We just don't know much about sicknesses of the mind. Antietam drew upon universal themes of psychiatric medicine through the First World War in that psychological health was viewed through the lenses of Victorian and Edwardian beliefs. Most doctors during the First World War were not mental health specialists and did not receive any form of mental health training. There was no universal consensus among Western Front doctors regarding the treatment of shell shock victims as they debated the causes and origins of shell shock. Despite the advancement of physical medicine during the war, it was clear that despite the suffering of many shell shock soldiers and officers on the front lines, Psychiatry still did not advance in the Western medical community after the war due to the stigma of mental health, in which shell shock victims were seen as insane. Camrock's play implied that many shell shock veterans were left without medical support. Camrock's play also showed Camrock's play also showed that attending to a shell-shocked family member could lead to the breakdown of the family unit. The author illustrated that Jim's family almost collapsed as his family members disagreed about how to care for Jim's mental health. Camrock revealed that many families after the Great War struggled to care for their traumatized loved ones. The stress experienced by Jim's family is a testament to the ways in which all military families were intertwined with the war and its consequences, whether through directly participating on the home front or attending to an injured loved one. Although Jim's family barely managed to care for him, the reality was that many families gave up on their shell-shocked loved ones due to challenges related to violence and drinking. Some families confined their veterans to mental institutions where some of these veterans would spend the rest of their lives. The play also explored themes surrounding masculinity and what it meant to be a man in the time of a world war. Jim showed that the U.S. Army did not tolerate cowardice from its members. According to Jim, I didn't want to die like Bobby. How could they expect me to fight? The sergeant, ain't you a man, Erickson? Yellow bellied coward. Antietam showed that expecting soldiers to die for their country served as the supreme test of masculinity and courage, regardless of the character's individual belief. The play implies the soldiers who displayed cowardice during hostilities were subjected to persecution, their masculinity was questioned, and they could even be court-martialed and possibly executed for cowardice and desertion. The fact that Jim refused to fight underlines the destructive precedent set forth by the war in that all soldiers were expected to achieve total victory for the glory of their country. As our protagonist Jim learned and observed firsthand, there was no glory to be achieved in the First World War, only a grisly, gruesome death. Camrock's work revealed the inner workings of a shell-shocked veteran's mind. Despite the family's commitment to saving Jim, they cannot save him from being haunted by the ghost of a deceased comrade who died horrifically on the Western Front. Bobby, you all right, Bobby? There's somebody over there, over behind that barn. That was close. Bobby, watch yourself. Bobby! Bobby's gruesome death imprinted itself on Jim's psyche. For Jim, Bobby's violent death was too traumatizing for the protagonist to forget. The experience of Bobby's death revealed that Jim is haunted by his friend's deathly screams. This theme has resonated with research on other military personnel experiencing shell shock. For example, historian Wendy Holdwin showed that in the case study of Private N.V., a hospitalized British shell-shock soldier, Private Envy was haunted by the ghosts of the Germans he had bayoneted to come to take revenge on him. Historian Daniel Hitt also illustrated in a similar case study that nights were the worst for British shell-shock officers because they were haunted by the ghost of their deceased friends. Indeed, the play highlighted that witnessing the brutal death of a fellow friend or comrade was enough to drive some veterans to the brink of insanity. Camrock's Antietam is a heart-wrenching play about the return of a shell-shock veteran and his psychological struggles in post-war America. It is a gripping tale that explores family relations and the challenges of connecting to an absent-minded loved one. I highly recommend that anyone interested in the First World War and the history of shell shock to read this play. What makes Antietam incredibly unique is that it is the second known play about shell shock, alongside the 1918 play by Eugene O'Neill. Antietam is also unique because it shows the perspectives of every character and how each one was personally affected by Jim's shell shock. Jim and his family experiences with shell shock reflected the reality that some families indeed endured decades of misery from their shell shocked loved ones, while others left unable to reconcile themselves to a life of a man they no longer knew. In some cases, some shell shock veterans died by suicide in the 1920s to save their families from the trouble. Antietam's recent discovery will no doubt capture the public's attention as everyone has or will experience mental health issues at some time in their life. Utilizing this play to teach history to contemporary audiences will expose them to social justice issues, the violence and long-term consequences of the First World War, and the ongoing stigmatization of mental health in the military. Antietam will no doubt contribute to the American historiography of shell shock. Camrock's play brings attention to a group of marginalized combat veterans from the First World War to demonstrate the psychological suffering that gripped so many lives. Hold your applause. And now I'm just going to pause for a second and bring up my second PowerPoint. Okay, just give me 1 second. Okay. The second I'm about to tell you is actually a Canadian film on shell shock from 1919. I also discovered this Canadian film in the archives. The Canadian narrative of shell shock is not well known as the British story has dominated most of the literature. What's significant about this Canadian film is that it is the only post-World War I film on shell shock in either the Canadian or the British narrative. Okay. Sorry. Uh, Review slideshow in the beginning. Okay, so the film is called Shell Shocked, but Shell Shocked, but I added a few extra words. A Canadian film about the experience of psychological trauma in the Great War. The signing of the armistice on November 11, 1918, brought the Great War to an end on the Western Front for Canada and its allies. The transition from soldier to civilian after the war was a difficult task for most veterans. For many Canadians, they were scarred by their combat experience on the Western Front. Their minds were broken as tens of thousands of Canadian veterans dealt with the aftermath of shell shock. Canadian shell shock veterans were often misunderstood and marginalized due to older ideas about psychological medicine in which they were seen as insane. Some veterans struggled to reconnect with families, find employment, and were isolated from former communities. At the same time, shell shock was a complicated war wound, and some veterans understood shell shock because of their time in the Great War. One Canadian veteran who understood shell shock was Sergeant John Joseph Atherton of the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Born in 1872 in Salford, Lancashire, England, Atherton settled down in Calgary, Alberta. He enlisted as a private in Calgary with the 82nd Battalion on September 16, 1915, and rose to the rank of sergeant on May 30, 1916. Atherton was eventually sent to the 9th Reserve Battalion at St. Martin's Plain, Shorncliffe on July 14, also 1916. Not a shell-shock veteran himself, having only experienced indigestion and remained in England for the duration of his service, Atherton is likely to have heard about shell-shock and possibly encountered shell-shock soldiers. He eventually traveled back to Canada on January 25th, 1917, and was medically discharged from the service on July 5th. After the war, Atherton starred in a short film titled Shell Shock. His idea for shell shock came from his son Ernest, who himself was diagnosed with the condition during the war. Acting as Major Jack Hathaway in the film, Atherton appeared in person and speaking the actual living, breathing words of the shell-shocked major, hero of the play, while the film projected onto the screen. Written by Atherton himself and toured throughout Alberta to promote the film, Atherton's shell shock brought attention to the shell shock phenomenon, which impacted tens of thousands of Canadian veterans. In Shell Shock, Atherton portrayed Major Jack Hathaway, who returned home for rest and is a victim of his own nerves. As Hathaway arrived home, he anticipated his family to welcome him. As he moved from one location to another during the service, he did not receive any mail from his loved ones. Fearing the worst outcome, Hathaway doubts his wife's unfaithfulness. As Hathaway arrived home, his house is empty, and fearing the worst about his wife, Hathaway becomes enraged and destroys the family portrait. Later on in the film, Hathaway is reunited with his wife and children in their home, and the film happily ends. Shell Shock was directed by David Hartford of the Curwood Shipment Company and produced by the Imperial Film Company. It was played at the Regent and Monarch Theaters in Alberta in 1919. This film was also shown in American and Canadian movie cinemas throughout the 1920s. Atherton's Shell Shock brings attention to the plight of shell shock veterans in Canada by connecting audiences to the experiences of Major Hathaway, helping to destigmatize the condition of shell shock, which was my argument for my article. Atherton's film connected Canadian audiences to the horrors of the Great War. After the war, some Canadian veterans could not speak about their military service on the Western Front. For some, after witnessing the violent death or mutilation of a friend or comrade, it was too painful to discuss with their families. Veterans turned to one another as they shared an unspeakable bond and could relate to one another. Shell Shock provided Canadian audiences with a small glimpse into the life of soldiering. In Shell Shock, Sergeant Joe Atherton portrays most vividly one of the hallucinations of shell shock that might take possession of the soldier under this affliction. Atherton's film brings attention to the fact that any Great War soldier, even the most hardened, could succumb to shell shock from the strains of warfare. As the review advertiser best describes, office soldiers and even officers could have a nervous breakdown at any moment in combat, regardless of social status. Shell Shock showcased to Canadian audiences that shell shock was not an invisible war wound. The Red Deer Advocate reveals shell shock is an up-to-the-minute hit as the plot deals with the returned soldier problem and a startling near domestic tragedy. Indeed, the film brings attention to the fact that the shell shock phenomenon was a national tragedy. Unable to live with their internal scars, some shell shock veterans died by suicide during the 1920s. The Toronto Star reported that Private R. Smith of Winnipeg killed himself by slitting his throat. The Kingston Standard revealed that Private Henry Woosoon committed suicide in Woodstock, Ontario by consuming carbolic acid. Finally, although not directly linking veteran J.E. Taylor's suicide to shell shock, the Saskatchewan Daily Star disclosed that Taylor was diagnosed with shell shock in France. He hung himself in Carville, Saskatchewan. The cases of Smith, Wassoon, Taylor, and many others in post-war Canada highlight that some veterans' minds were beyond saving. Historian Jonathan Scowlin conveys that in 1919, about 40% of public suicides were related to Canadian veterans of the First World War. Shellshock made it abundantly clear that while the Great War ended in 1918, tens of thousands of veterans were reliving the horrors of combat in their minds. Atherton Shellshock supported local veterans as they transitioned from soldier to civilian. According to the Calgary Daily Herald, the Regent Theatre offered to devote 50% of the net profits of the complete performances for those 4 days to the Great Wars Veterans Association of Calgary. The fact that Atherton's film originally established as a benefit community for veterans in 1916, it became the Calgary branch of the Great Wars Veterans Association of Canada in 1917. Its purpose was to support local Calgarians as they adjusted to civilian life. By 1919, 3,200 Calgarians had joined the branch. The fact that Atherton's film had a partnership with the Calgary branch highlighted that Atherton understood the perspectives of returned Canadian veterans who underwent the experience of shell shock. Indeed, Atherton sympathized that shell shock veterans were a marginalized group of Great War soldiers who required understanding, acceptance, and treatment for their traumatized minds. The film also donated to the Great Wars Veterans Association of Calgary as the film portrayed that shell shock veterans could be rehabilitated and integrated into society with time. Shell shock made it clear that shell shock veterans were not insane or broken men. In the film, the arrival of the returning heroes at the 8th Field Ambulance Corps showed that the wounded, which included both physical and psychological casualties, served their country and were heroes for their contribution to the war effort. The fact that the film included stirring scenes and happy reunions highlighted the film's message that not all shell-shock veterans lived debilitating lives, and some even had contented lives, as demonstrated by Hathaway's reunion with his family. Along with the film's promotion, the Calgary Daily Herald indicated that shell shock did not rob veterans of their identity and that the great majority of the sufferers are restored to complete manhood once they have undergone medical treatment. Most significantly, Atherton's film acted as a counter-narrative to the dominant theme that not all shell shock veterans were perceived as the man-man. It appeared that Canadian media in 1919 and the 1920s praised shell shock as a critically acclaimed success. According to the Edmonton Bulletin, the story of the shell shock veteran was met with understanding. Joe Atherton is to be congratulated upon the wonderful success he has obtained in the presentation of shell shock. That it was a revelation to all is putting it mildly. Sorry. The media's positive portrayal of Atherton's film was unique, as shell shock was highly criticized and viewed negatively by Canadian authorities after the war, who placed blame on veteran shell shock due to their lack of character or poor genetics. In many ways, shell shock and the media's positive reviews advanced the understanding of veterans' health among Canadian audiences. The attention the media brought to the film was a significant moment for Canadian veterans, as Atherton's acting as Major Hathaway brought justice to many shell shock veterans who were misunderstood for their internal wounds. My article My article argued that shell shock introduced Canadian viewers to the condition of shell shock, helping to destigmatize the condition and enlighten the experiences of Canadian shell shock veterans. Shell shock was way ahead of its time and showed to audiences that cases of shell shock arose from the inhumane conditions of the First World War, not from poor genetics or lack of character. It was a learning opportunity for Canadian audiences to see the perspectives of a shell shock veteran and a psychological suffering in post-war Canada. While there is no surviving evidence to highlight the reaction of ordinary Canadians, it is possible that the film generated dialogue among viewers about the consequences of the Great War. What is most likely is that Canadian veterans were impacted by the film and could relate to Major Hathaway's experiences. Although the film does not exist anymore, my article is the film's first analysis in more than 100 years and hopes to inspire dialogue among Canadians about mental illness. Shell Shock was a significant film that told the veterans' narrative of shell shock to Canadian audiences and did not hesitate to convey that the Great War led to a generation of broken minds. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cam. This was an interesting and unique perspective on wars. One that I'm a researcher and scholar, so I'm always thinking about new ideas and pathways. This was a great segue for me to think about some of the work that I do. So thank you for your presentation.
You're very welcome.
I do have a question.
Of
In
course.
your research, I know that this is a topic that you're currently engaged in. Have you seen any evidence of support that the country offered returning soldiers, and what types of resources were given to returning soldiers?
With returning soldiers, I would argue that I know more about how they were treated during the war and then after during the war. So during the war, both officers and soldiers were sent to specialized hospitals where they received treatments such as diet, rest, massage, hydrotherapy, and even the theory of the talking therapy. Talking therapy was introduced by the British, and it was a method in which a psychologist and a shell shock victim would sit down, have a 1 hour one-on-one discussion, and this was a time for a shell shock victim to discuss his dreams, his hopes, his fears. The belief was by uncovering the root of his anxiety, it could lead to some sort of cure, and by confronting his haunted memories through dialogue and discussion, the soldier can make peace with those fears and live some sort of normal life. Most men during the First World War came from the lower working classes, so they were not used to discussing their feelings openly in front of another man. For some, they thought that they were being manipulated into discussing their dreams with a psychologist who would then determine whether or not they would return to the front. But for many, it brought comfort and relief because they were able to discuss the root of the problem, make sense of it, and even move on. Some psychologists during the First World War, including Dr. W.H.R. Rivers, who was known as a miracle maker for getting his patients to open up and helping his patients live comfortable lives once they disclosed their fears. He believed in some cases it's better to repress the memory and that some experiences are too traumatizing that it can actually cause more pain to the victim. So he believed that it's better for patient in those circumstances just to suppress the memories and to find other ways to distract themselves and keep their minds occupied.
Wow, that's interesting. Thank you for that. We are opening it up to questions. If you want to come on and ask your questions, you can, or if you want to put them in the chat, I'll be happy to share them.
Sure.
Should I just go?
Actually, I'd like
Jim,
to
you,
make a
oh,
Go
comment.
ahead.
I'm an ed, may I?
yes, go ahead.
Okay, I'm Annette Davenport. Okay, I am a licensed mental health counselor. I did my doctoral research on transition of veterans. And what I found was military members are actually very successful, most of them, in their transition into the civilian workforce.
Mhm.
And so I find this topic that you presented very, very interesting because I'm still currently working in an environment where I have Air Force civilian populations that are actually veterans themselves. And I've also been listening to Victor Davis Hanson's information on World War One, World War Two, and what he said recently, that the latest that I had heard him say, that Canadians and American troops really went over to fight the wars in World War One and World War Two for ideological reasons.
Mhm.
Whereas in Europe, they were concerned about land, taking back their homeland or whatever it was. But we have a unique population of veterans in that we were not going back over there to take land. We were helping other people to regain their land. And so that kind of, well, did I go over there to do the right thing? That's one of the big questions I think we found that a lot of our, even in Vietnam, a lot of our veterans had in their minds. And so when we talk about that transition of military into the civilian workforce, and I think one of the questions that came out of the conference in 2024 from the Veterans uh, Studies Association was, how can we take the experiences of our veterans and help the civilian population at large reframe that into their own circumstances? And I think this is a great way. We see a lot of terrorist acts now and just civilian uh, environments, and a lot of people are traumatized in a lot of different ways, and how do they continue to live their lives and move on? So I'm really glad you brought all this up. And the one thing that I do see and starting to recognize is that the younger military that are in service now, sometimes they do express that they are kind of differentiated even from those that are still active duty, the older, not the older, but
Mhm.
the more experienced folks, that you're not really like us because you didn't have that deployment experience like we had. So again, I'm concerned about that kind of division and that kind of rift even within the military ranks, active duty. So I think, you talking about us becoming more aware of our experience, or the
Mhm.
experience of the veterans is extremely important because every situation is different and
Mhm.
every conflict is different. So thank you for doing that.
You're very welcome.
Jim.
Yeah. Annetta, I think you've raised a good point that I just want to touch before I ask my question. This idea of parsing out service, even in the veteran community, is not new, right? The VFW didn't accept Korean War vets for a good portion of, into the 60s, right? Because that they weren't like us. They were a different experience. And
Yeah.
so I don't think that's new, but it's a thing that we constantly have to keep our mind and our finger on. And if, like me, working with student veterans, you have to remind them that the experience might be different, the context
Mhm.
might be different, or the context might be different, but the experiences are very, very similar. Cameron, I'm going back to you. So, how did you end up? You're in an educational studies, I think, degree program. How
Yes.
did you end up in studying and thinking about, uh, the drama of the drama creation, the creation of theater or film around veterans in Canada? Like, well, how did you get there? What and how does it
I
relate?
I did my MA in history, and my research paper was on the abolishing of the Army death penalty for cowardice and desertion after the First World War for shell shock veterans in Britain. So that's where my background is. I have my background and my BA and my thesis for my BA focused on the 1922 Committee of Inquiry into Shell Shock. With regards to the theater background of Shell Shock, this I discovered this play by total accident in the archives, and when I reached out to the theater where the play was performed in 1958, they informed me that that they were hoping that a copy of the play was available somewhere in the archives, and their website said it is so. When they got back to me, they told me that they actually had to bring it over from one of their buildings, and the staff at the building had no idea that this play even existed. I discovered the play on newspapers.com and seeing how I'm not a theater major, but seeing how it's shell shock and relates to my dissertation, I saw it as an opportunity to pounce on it and to write about it.
Yeah, super
Unfortunately,
interesting. Yeah, what a good find.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I have a copy of the play from 1958, but because of the whole issue of copyright, figuring out who's the descendant now, it cannot be publicly released.
Huh. It's just an interesting find. I don't think it's and this is gonna sound I'm not an expert in it. I don't it doesn't feel like it's out of the realm of the normal in that era of theater, but clearly it came and it went into a box and people forgot. And
Yes, that's
very
from
glad
what the staff told me. It's been forgotten or just hidden away for 60 years.
yeah, that's so great. Thank you for your work on it. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
I just thought as you were talking that, it's so uncomfortable for those people who have not been around the military to see this type of topic, portrayed on the screen because it's not a side of life that they really want to see, to know that they exist. So we send the veterans, right? Or we send the
Mhm.
military off to do their thing in an invisible place where we don't see it, we don't hear it, and it's fine. But once it's like in front of us, it's like, oh no, that's just way too uncomfortable. So that's part of our society denying the reality of the situation, sending other people to do our job, well, not our job, but do
Mhm.
something for us that we probably could never do or would not be willing to do. And then
Mhm.
when they do come back, their voices are marginalized. They really are, because no one understands them. But I mean, it's great to have all kinds of information about this, but it seems to be so negative, right? For whatever reason. But it's nice to know, like you said, that there is life after the military and there are still struggles, but people, our warriors are resilient, they can get through it, as
Right.
long as they have somebody on their side, they'll get through it.
I very much agree with you. And today, shell shock, during the Second World War, it was no longer called shell shock. The term was abolished in the 1920s. Shell shock then became battle fatigue during World War II, and then from post-Vietnam onwards, became known as PTSD, which has been then clinically recognized during the 1960s. Although, Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Affairs Canada recognize the implications and causes of PTSD, and there is treatment. I would argue that the cultural stigma of PTSD still exists. And when reading the stories of modern combat or Canadian veterans who served in Afghanistan, a lot of them have said that the moment you say you have PTSD or you're feeling funny, that you become almost like a liability in the military, that you become known as that guy with the issues. And many of them have said that they do not come forward to discuss mental health treatment because of fear of stigma, loss of income, loss of rank, loss of job opportunities. So that's why when many Canadian veterans, and I'm sure it's very similar in the American context, leave the militaries, that's why even still 100 years later, they go to the Legion, they form these tight-knit community groups online or on Facebook or at a local bar, because many of them understand one another, and a lot of them have said by having that small community of soldiers, not just with PTSD, but with other struggles or with other physical wounds they've diagnosed, it almost creates a sense of belonging for them, that the man next to me understands the perspectives or the experiences I underwent.
Yes. And, and Victor Davis Hanson said that what happens is that people um, don't understand, the soldiers' experience, but there are times in our history of mankind where soldiers had to step up, the generals and so forth had to make very tough decisions that had to do with people dying, and they were very unpopular, like they were hated. And so sometimes we as human beings, even in the civilian sector, have to make decisions that are very unpopular. But I think our service members, they're the very ones who understand how to make these tough decisions, and we need to be able to help them to come out and say it's okay to be you and have these struggles, and to teach other people that it's okay to make very tough decisions, do very ugly things that society would be appalled at, but yet some of these things were done for ideological, better for everyone, humanity, that kind of thing. And it wasn't like a personal choice that they made.
I
Yeah.
agree. Well, during the First World War, it was very much when the Canadians fought, it was very much to protect or to liberate the oppressed peoples of Belgium and France, but also ideological, in which was for king and country.
Oh, I see. Yeah. And see, that's the thing. The American veteran or soldier would never know about the king and country,
Nope.
right? We live under a constitution. So that's another different perspective. You die for your king,
And the
where
reason
I don't
why
know.
the Americans entered into 1917 was because of the Zimmerman controversy and the unrestricted submarine warfare.
Wow. And I heard that the Canadians suffered a large loss and they fought very bravely, but we don't hear about Canadians very
No.
much in the world wars.
And it's
Yeah,
very much similar to the Korean War, how the Korean War is very much forgotten and not discussed much.
yeah, yeah. And at a personal level, my father's father was a World War I veteran. And the
Wow.
only thing I ever heard about my grandfather was that he drank a lot. And then when I found out that he was a World War I veteran, it all made sense to me. But
Drinking
no one
was
ever talked about he being a veteran. They
no.
said he was mean. They said he drank a lot. He was awful, all of this kind of stuff. And I didn't know him as
Drinking
a
was a
veteran
way
of
of
World War
how
One.
veterans
Yeah.
numbed their, it was the way how they would numb themselves to forget about their troubles.
Yes. Yes. And that idea of trench warfare, it was horrendous. Maybe it might have been great for the Romans, 1,000 years ago, whatever. But when you put in modern weapons and the technology and you are stuck in this little tiny space and you're like a sitting duck, I cannot imagine what that feels like. There's
I
no way
agree.
I can imagine that. Yeah. So I'm excited for your work. I hope you have a chance to do more.
Thank you, Annette.
And yeah,
Well, thank you all so much for this great conversation. I am excited for your work as well. Kim, you
Thank
gave
you,
some
Dr.
really
Anderson.
great segues. Anetta, you gave some great segues for me. I've taken notes on some of the things that you shared. So thank you so much for this great conversation today. And thank you for this series. Our next session will be on May 15th. And so we'll start sharing that out soon. But thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.
that's awesome.
All right.
Yes, thank you. You all take care.
Thank
Have a
you.
wonderful
Bye-bye.
Bye.
day.
Have a great long weekend.
You
Thank you.
too.